Kulla. Children, hmm? Children, IGNOU Meg 6 last minute suggestion. Dickinson's poetry, the soul selects our own society. I'm saying every day, it would never be common more, I said. I measure every grief I meet because I could not stop for death. My life has stood a loaded gun. Rearrange your wife's affection. Here, imagery of Dickinson's poetry is being discussed. The idea that the soul selects her own society is the most important point of discussion that we'll be discussing now. So, the idea that the soul selects her own society, that people choose a few companions who matter to them and exclude everyone else if possible from their inner consciousness, conjures up images of a solemn ceremony with the ritual closing of the door, the chariots, the emperor, and the ponderous valves of the soul's attention. Dickinson makes use of several literary devices in The Soul Selects Her Own Society. These include, but are not limited to, caesura, alliteration, and personification. The latter is seen throughout the poem when Dickinson gives the soul agency to choose what to do, what to does, and where it does. Though the use of divine Through the use of divine imagery to that of closed doors, Emily Dickinson alludes to the speaker of the poems like for her own self rather than others. Her society is but her own beliefs and her own divine majority. The impressive syntactical structure of the soul selects her own society, creates a powerful expression of image pattern that is symbolic of a soul selecting her own society. In order to effectively highlight the pattern of imagery, the usage of syntax, the tone of certain words, will be examined. In order, these are the word, tone words of Dickinson's poem: soul, poor, door, divine, obtrude, chariot, gate, emperor, mat, nation, one, valves, and so stone. There is a pattern of imagery here that is but interpreted once with match in 80. The soul selects own society alternates from divinity, soul divine, chariot, emperor, nation, and valves to the expression of closer, door, obtrude no more, gate, one, and stone. The interruption of mat, a symbol of welcome, is used to represent the false welcoming appearance that some display but never intend on actually putting to practice. Through the use of divine imagery to that of closed doors, Emily Dickinson alludes to the speaker of the poem like for her own self rather than others. Her society is but her own belief and her own divine majority. This interpretation is backed by the reputation of unmoved by the speaker toward the emperor's entrance. The speaker, stubborn and divine, will not take him in, approaching the work through its rhyme scheme. I come to realize a similar interpretation. What imagery does Emily Dickinson use? Dickinson uses the image of lightning in tell all the truth but tell it slant. Enjambment in I never hear that one is dead. And dashes in the brain is wider than the sky to undermine certainty in meaning. Now, what is the theme and imagery of Emily Dickinson? Like most writers, Emily Dickinson wrote about what she knew and about what intrigued her. A keen observer, she used images from nature, religion, law, music, commerce, medicine, fashion, and domestic activities to probe universal themes. The wonders of nature, the identity of the self, death and immortality, and love. How do the imagery support the theme of the poem? Adi? The whole poem symbolizes the transition from life to death. Through the use of brilliant imagery and symbols, she, she describes a beautiful day that leads the children from innocence to experience. The poem begins with the speaker declaring how the sun rises or day begins. And what is the main imagery of the poem? Poetic imagery, the sentence and figurative language used in poetry. The object experience that a poet is contemplating is usually perceived by that poet in a relationship to some second object or even person or thing. The room, if you think, that is to be wondered, the poem It Would Never Be Common, more I said, recounts a love affair. So, this love affair is the poet's own thought and imagery that he thinks he would like to expound before us and how he would like to do it. Now, this imagery which you would like to put or place it before us is something like the poem It Would Never Be Common, more I said, recounts a love affair. The speaker begins by recounting a moment that ushered in the most sublime period of the affair, as if confiding in a dear friend or period of the affair, as if confiding a dear friend or diary and letting the reader enter into the middle of the conversation. The speaker recalls saying how the love affair had gone beyond the usual common sort. Yes, there had been problems in the past, but now things had improved. And even though the occasional unpleasantness still occurred from time to time, she had so much love and joy that the pain was easier. In the fullness of the love affair, the speaker felt as if she were flying rather than walking, that her love was so apparent in her eye and blushing cheek that everyone knew it. She was so overflowing with love that she devoured all the world and gave a golden word to every creature that she met. But then she beloved, but then the beloved left her and ended the affair. The speaker was beggared by the experience and seemed to have gone mad, clutching and groping at sounds and shapes and feelings, a wilderness take over where once there was a golden love. The dress she used to wear is now like sackcloth to her. In the final line, she wonders what happened to her moment of blockade and a drop of India. The love affair has been condensed to a moment and a single drop. Brocade is a luxurious contrast to rough sackcloth. India would have been seen by Dickinson as an exotic and extravagant plant of beauty and spices and mystery. In this poem, the narrator compares the grief other people are suffering with her own, implying this is a hobby of sorts for her. I measure every grief I meet with narrow, probing eyes. I wonder if it weighs like mine or has an easier size. In other words, the speaker wonders if other people's grief is as profound and intense as hers, or if they suffer less. The speaker goes on to wonder in stanza 3, if the other grief sufferers contemplate suicide, could they choose between life and death? It would not be to die. She then moves on to note that some sufferers come to smile again, but it seems a faded smile, an imitation, perhaps, like an oil painting. In stanzas 5 and 6, she discusses how long grief seems to last, centuries, and then moves to the various reasons people she observes suffer: the death of someone else, the grief of want or not having one material needs met, and the pain of despair. The speaker ends by stating that why she cannot know what another person's sorrow is. This vocabulary of pain is an allusion to Christ. So you find that the speaker is also deeply religious to Christ's sufferings on the cross, gives her the comfort of knowing she is not alone. In fact, the suffering of some might be like my own. That is the idea, that is the impression of the suffering of mankind all around the world. The suffering is the same, only the matter differs. Imagery drawn from everyday life to describe a subject. She condenses grief into an object that can be weighed, uses hyperbole by saying that grief lasts 1,000 years, a way to describe how endless it can seem, and employs allusions to Christ's crucifixion at the end to bring home the depth of suffering. The poem is no longer than most of the Dickensians, but equally as stark and direct in its evocation of emotion. Unlike much 19th century poetry, the speaker of the poem does not take comfort in the promise of resurrection or an afterlife, but in the concept of the crucified Christ as a fellow sufferer. She does not attempt to gloss over the pain people feel, but instead names and universalizes it. Because I could not stop for death, at its core, this is a poem about death. Surprise. At the beginning of the poem, death comes to fetch the speaker for a carriage ride. The rest of the poem shows the speaker coming to terms with the transition from life into death. In fact, the journey into death is what Dickinson really grapples with throughout the poem. Once death picks the speaker up for their carriage ride, they travel along a country path that allows the speaker to observe children at a play and the beauties of nature. Death takes a leisurely pace and treats the speaker kindly along the way. These depictions of the speaker's journey to death reveal what death means to the speaker of the poem. The speaker seems to be saying that the hardest part about death isn't always the act of dying itself. In fact, they say that they could not stop for death, possibly because they were too busy living. However, this poem takes a closer look at the process of coming to terms with death and how death is unavoidable. This is a struggle that any reader can relate to, since death is sometimes we all will all have to confront someday, a day before or a day earlier. By the final stanza of the poem, the speaker achieves something that we all might hope for as well. They are at peace with her life coming to an end. They see a new home rising up from the earth with its roots in the ground. In other words, death has taken the speaker to their grave. But the speaker doesn't view their grave negatively. It is not a scary place. Instead, it is the location where the speaker comes face to face with eternity. The poems My Life Has Stood a Loaded gun, central metaphor of a loaded gun to describe the speaker's life, suggests pent up rage, as does the reference to Mount Vesuvius, the volcano whose eruption in the year 79 famously wiped out Pompeii. My life had stood a loaded gun by Emily Dickinson described the sleeping power of a woman who is being wielded by a master in a male dominated world. The first line, however, is quite shocking in comparing her life to loaded gun. Dickinson suggests she could go off at any moment she's ready to fire. In the case of my life had stood a loaded gun, the surface meaning is about a personified gun. But delve a little deeper into the text and the Dickinson's view on women and poetry are perhaps revealed. A woman and her words are not only powerful, but in a man's world will stand the test of time. Dickinson developed a unique new method of her own. She compared the loaded gun to the mood of waiting eagerly for lovers coming. In this poem, love isn't soft any longer. As soon as a lover turned up in front of her, the constrained emotion wouldn't be triggered off at any moment. It expresses the longing to love exactly. Rearing your wife's affection is a poem. Rearing your wife's affection is a poem in which the narrator means to say has denounced the miserable plight of a wife. She is also portrayed the sad life of a single woman. The society pretends to put in order, that is, tame and domesticate a woman into the mold of a traditional wife. This is to be achieved by amputating ruthlessly her spotted heart. In other words, to stiffening her natural impulses. It is also to be achieved by making her look like a man with a beard. That is, not only her natural impulses are ruthlessly curbed, but even her natural looks are made to appear harsh and forbidding. Note the phrase, freckled bosom, perhaps refers to the weaknesses and foibles that a woman is likely to have. The narrator urges the strong natural impulses to blush, that is, to feel a sense of shame. She also urges the desire of the woman to blush, that is, to feel a sense of shame. The compound of shame and guilt is due to the pressures exerted by the society in New England. The reality, however, is that the protagonist, a single woman, has learned far more as a spinster than she would have learned as a traditional wife. She has had no experience of wifehood, that is domestic drudgery and slavery, yet 7 years of solitary life as a spinster has taught her an unforgettable lesson. Her life has been such that love has not leaped its socket. That is, love has not fulfilled the natural hunger. She also could not experience trust, that is basic for one's growth. As a result of which the pain, narrow, stifling pain, has been entrenched in her life. She has also no taste of constancy in love that would have given her a sense of fulfillment. There has been no balm, no medicine for the anguish and grief that has seared her. Life has been a terrible burden for her, although so far she has endured the burden triumphantly. She is not likely to be crowned, that is, to attain fulfillment and happiness till sunset, that is, till the end of her life. She would be picked by thorns. It is perhaps only after death that she would finally be crowned. In other words, she would put her on her diadem. These lines appear to be prophetic because Emily Dickinson got recognition as a great poet only after her death. As a romantic poet, her poetry is a mirror of her apprehensions and hope. There is, however, a big script in her life. It is big, but it is also a sort of bandage over her eyes. That secret, that mystery would never vanish. It would disappear only the day she would die, and her tired flesh would be at last have some rest. She would then be released, if or from what the agony, from the agony of, so she'll be relieved from the agony, relieved from the fever, the agony, and the prison of life. She'll be buried in the grave, and later on she'll be united with him. That is the bridegroom. In other words, it is only after death that she would attain fullness and triumph. She could not endure to be a wife. She also could not be happy as a single woman in 19th century New England. That was the dilemma of Emily Dickinson. What are the significant features of Mending Wall and the Birches? To know the meaning of these two poems, Mending Wall and the Birches, we must understand what are these poems about on a literal level. Mending Wall tells about the story of a rock wall. So that is very important to note. The story of a rock world. To know the meaning of these two poems, Mending Wall and Birches, we first must understand what are these poems about on a literal level. Mending Wall tells about the story of a rock wall that is built to separate two properties, the speaker and his neighbor, in the countryside, and something is always destroying it. On the other hand, we have the poem of Birches, of Birchs, Birches, and the speaker talks about how he does not like how the birches bend because of the storm. So he imagines the children are the ones who climb the birch trees. So that is his consolation. In his own way, he thinks it. No one makes him think it, but he thinks it his own way. As high as they can, and they, when they have reached the point where the birch can support their weight anymore, they bend the birch because they kick their legs and pull. Both Bending Wall and Birches detail a story about the interpersonal relationship. Each story has a different meaning behind it. In Bending Wall, the underlying message is about the relationship between neighbors and a wall that divides them. In Birches, the underlying message is about the childhood through the eyes of a man. In Mending Wall, there is a wall dividing two neighbors from one another, which keeps the relationship good. The only time they ever meet is when they are doing maintenance work on the wall. The speaker doesn't believe in having a wall just for the sake of having a wall. As the neighbor said, good fences make good neighbors. The only problem is that the speaker doesn't give up the tree down to one side. The main theme of Mending Wall is the difficulty of change in society. Social customs and traditions are important sometimes, but Frost points out the struggle to change the same once they are rooted in society. Then the question might arise, is Mending Wall blank verse? Examples of blank verse include Mending Wall, Robert Frost almost. Anything by Frost will be a solid example. Robert Frost was inspired to write Mending Wall after talking with one of his family friends, Napoleon Gay. He learned from talking with his neighbor that writing in the tones of real life is an important factor in his poetic form. The narrator reveals the poem's central irony. On a practical level, the wall is useless. The purpose of the wall between farms is to prevent livestock from crossing over. The title reflects on the famous wall at hand and refers to the ritual that our speaker and his speaker undergo and his neighbor undergo every spring to fix this wall. Mending Wall, poem by Robert Frost, published in the collection North of Boston, 1914. It is written in blank verse and depicts a pair of neighboring farmers, together working on the annual code of rebuilding their common wall. What is personified in mending wall? In the beginning of the mending wall, the speaker uses personification to imply that there is something unnatural in nature that abhors walls and will always seek to bring them down. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it and spills up a boulders in the sun. And the figures of speech used in Robert Frost's poem Mending Wall are simile, metaphor, and rhetorical questions, assonance, and alliteration. Other poetic devices in the poem include humor and sarcasm and symbolism. What is the conclusion of the Mending Wall poem? In the conclusion of the Mending Wall summary, the poet wishes his neighbor figures it out because he does not want to change his traditional thinking, so much so that he repeats the statement of good fences again. The poem revolves around the story of two neighbors who comes across each other in spring every year to mend the stone wall that separates their farms. The poem demonstrates how good fences create good neighbors and how people can preserve their long lasting relation with neighbors by founding such walls. What is the major metaphor in mending wall? What is the major metaphor in mending wall? If that is the question, the central metaphor in this poem is the wall itself. It comes to represent the division between people, things that keep them apart. The mood of mending wall is curious and thoughtful. The speaker in the poem demonstrates curiosity when they question why the wall is necessary and why their neighbor thinks the wall makes good neighbors. This curiosity is what drives the narrative forward. Then we can ask the question, is mending wall a dramatic monologue? In mending wall, their neighbor represents the outdated aspects and beliefs of society. The poem states that the neighbor's character is one that stands by what his father, traditions, older generations believes. Why is mending wall modernism? The Mending Wall by Robert Frost is a poem that illustrates no matter what the speaker and his neighbor do to try be civilized by having a fence between their properties. Nature keeps tearing the fence down. This deals with the modernist views of fragmentation, isolation, and loss of control. The poem features only two characters, both being main characters. These characters are the unnamed speaker and the neighbor. The two characters own adjoining orchards, and the poem centers around the two meetings to mend the titular wall that separates the orchards. So the theme of the poem is the message an author wants to communicate through the piece. The theme differs from the main idea because the main idea describes what the text is mostly said about. Supporting details in a text can help lead a reader to the main idea. So, Mending Wall is another famous poem which highlights the pastoral element every year. Two neighbors meet to repair the wall, to repair the stone wall that divides their property. What is the speaker's point of viewing the mending wall? Robert Frost's Mending Wall is a poem that describes the thoughts and interpretations of the speaker due to the eponymous events. The speaker is unnamed and uses a first person perspective to relate the thoughts in the poem. Mending Wall begins with a mysterious stone. This stone is established by Robert Frost. First line. Something there is that doesn't love a wall. What this line refers to is never named in the poem. The mystery is reinforced by repeating the same statement in the 5th and 35th line. So, to summarize, Mending Wall is a poem about two neighbors coming together each spring to mend the wall that separates the two properties. Mending Wall by Robert Frost explores the nature of the human relationship. The speaker suggests there are two types of people, those who want walls and those who maybe they do not want. A birch smooths resinous, varicolor, or what white bark, marked by horizontal pores, lenticels, lenticels, which usually peels horizontally in thin sheets, especially in young trees. On older trunks, the thick, deeply furrowed bark breaks into irregular pits. And what is the significance of birches in poet's life? In the poem, the act of swinging on birches is presented as a way to escape the hard rationality or truth of the adult world, if only for a moment. As the boy climbs up the tree, he is climbing towards heaven and a place where his imagination can be. So, in Celtic folklore, the birch tree symbolized fertility, renewal, and purification. In festivity, Celts would burn bundles of birch trees to drive out spirits of the old year. The birch tree held significance during Beltane, now celebrated as May Day because of its representation of spring and new life. What is significance of birches in the Robert Frost? Birches by Robert Frost communicates in adults desire to escape the realities of adulthood for a while through the fun of playing child. The speaker is nostalgic for the carefree experience of singing from a birch tree and feels as though children were able to find fun in the most boring of times. This lesson suggests that the theme of the poem Birches is the tension between imagination and reality. In small groups, students go through the poem and find phrases and lines that talk about imagination and phrases and lines that talk about reality. Is Birches an allegory? The speaker uses truth, ironically, to express his skepticism of all belief, including silence. The speaker uses some images that could be seen as religious but expresses them in such a vague way that a reader can't turn Birches into a religious allegory. Frost, Frost's Birches, which is a pastoral poem, written to artistically portrait of the world in the symbolic images. The activity of birth singing from earth to heaven implies man's life, and it also imparts the message that man should maintain a balance between his duties on earth and his spiritual aspirations. He should set his life in such a manner that he should reach his goals by maintaining a fine balance. Frost was indeed a modernist poet, and Birches has several important characteristics of a modernist poem. Primarily, this poem has a dual focus on reality and the imagination. The poet acknowledges that he knows why the birch trees are usually bent, but he prefers the more quirky, QUIRKY explanation. So, in these two poems, there are variety of thoughts which are included in the poems of Robert Frost, which is very significant because it narrates to the life that we see around us. And not only that, we also understand life in its full perspective, life that should be understood, and life that should have significance of its existence, of understanding what it is. How do we think of this very concept of life? We never take it in the way, the manner the poet thinks about it. He is different in his thought because he is born in thought. So naturally he thinks in his way. So here we find that there are 3 points included in this very chapter. poems of Dickinson's, and also the poems of Frost, Mending Wall, and the Birches. All these 3 points are important for the IGNOU exam. And it is for this reason that the points have been included over here to make it very important for the students to know about it, to learn it thoroughly, not to get perturbed, and to take it sportingly as a reader, avid reader of poetry in modern literature.